Hey everyone, welcome to another Eldritch Moon Limited review video. In this video, we'll be talking about the 10 biggest bombs in the format. The cards in this list are basically the 10 cards I would be happiest to open in the first pack of an Eldritch Moon draft, and are all cards I would first pick over all of the uncommons in the format. So let's go ahead and get started. At number 10, we have Timmy O, Field Researcher. Timmy O does come with the significant downside of locking you into 3 colors, but if you get her, you should probably do your best to make it work. She's not the most powerful planeswalker ever. She asks, first of all, that you have at least some of a board to be at her best. The best planeswalkers don't need that. But provided you do have something going on the board, she's pretty amazing. Her +1 ability is pretty awesome for a couple of reasons. It says anytime the 2 creatures do combat damage, you get to draw a card. This means that any kind of damage during combat, whether to a creature, a planeswalker, or otherwise, counts. So even if your creature gets blocked, you draw a card, and so forth. What's more, in a dire situation, she can even target your opponent's creatures, and they're doing damage will draw you cards. That's obviously not the best use of her ever, but it does mean she can do something even when you're behind on board. She works even better if you manage to have some creatures with Vigilance or Double Strike, because it lasts until your next turn. Sometimes you can draw 2 cards off of one creature with Vigilance, and maybe even 4 off of Double Strike, but the latter's probably not going to happen. Her -2 is also good, and can buy you a little bit of time or make it so you get in for more damage. That even can set up the +1 because you can tap their creatures down, do your +1 thing, and then draw some cards. Like usual, her ultimate isn't going to happen real often, but when it does, hers is one of the best. She lets you draw 3 and gives you free spells. It's basically Ancestral Recall plus Omniscience, and that's pretty amazing. She would be higher on this list if she were only 1 color, but the cost of having to play 3 colors to make her work is a very significant downside. So let's go on to number 9. At number 9, we have another Planeswalker, Liliana the Last Hope. I don't think she's as powerful as Timmy O is, but she is monocolored and at a pretty low cost, so she can get out of hand early in the game. She can kill creatures, even if only limited to smaller ones, with her +1 ability, and she can help you get Delirium and draw you cards with her -2 ability. Her ultimate ability isn't actually that good unless you somehow end up in the zombie deck, which is possible. But like I said about Timmy O, you aren't going to get there all that often. But the fact that Liliana is a permanent that has a repeatable, albeit limited, removal spell and card draw ability is usually a good thing, and that's exactly what Liliana does. So let's move on to number 8. At number 8, we have Eternal Scourge. This card isn't exactly the flashiest, and it isn't going to completely break the board the turn you play it, or take over the game as in a directive a manner as Timmy O or Liliana might. But the card advantage it can grant you over time is pretty good. It can only really be killed in one way. Kill spells don't work on it, activated abilities don't work on it. It just gets exiled. It can come back from there. It's like always having an extra 3-mana 3/3 in your hand, and that's a pretty good deal, at least after your opponent tries to kill it one way or another. It does have the downside of getting exiled by any spell your opponent uses on it, including their combat tricks, and so it makes your combat tricks a little more flexible. The one area where this card really has a problem is being targeted by activated abilities. Usually your opponent's still going to have to use some mana to do that, so they're doing something, but if they're doing activated abilities, they're not using up a card and potentially paying less mana, and so you end up not finishing ahead there. But that's basically the only way it can be effectively dealt with. It can, of course, die in combat and not come back from exile, but a card that can only be dealt with in a few narrow ways is a pretty good card, even if that creature is just a 3/3. It can quickly become a problem for your opponent as you continue to recast it and they decide they want to kill it. Most often it'll probably just be a 3-mana 3/3 who doesn't get targeted by removal. It also benefits from being colorless, so you aren't locking yourself into anything if you first pick it. At number 7, we have the new Thalia Heretic Cathar. I feel like I just say Heretical Cathar, but anyway, it's a 3-mana 3/2 with first strike, and that's already a pretty good deal. Obviously not a huge bomb, but on top of that, it makes all of your opponent's creatures come into play tapped. It also does this for non-basic lands, but that's only going to be, it'll occasionally be relevant in limited, but mostly be relevant in constructed. But the fact that she makes your opponent's creatures come into play tapped is actually a pretty big deal. It completely sort of changes the rules of the game. Your opponent can't put down blockers, on their turn anymore. The creatures they play on their turn won't be able to block for a whole other turn. And that's a pretty big deal, especially because most white decks are fairly aggressive, and they're going to have pretty aggressive curves, so it'll be especially good in those. She alters the game in a significant enough way to, I think, be worthy of the title Bomb, even if she can be killed by a lot of the removal in the format. At number 6, we have Nimbus of Frost, a 4-mana 3/3 as a flyer, that is, as a fail case is already pretty reasonable, but not on top of that, it not only has prowess, but also the ability to tap creatures down for a turn. the first pick requires you to do a little bit, this first pick rather, requires you to do a little bit of a build around to really make it work, but luckily the blue-red spells deck has a lot of synergy cards and instants and sorceries to go around, and you aren't going to have a hard time building around it. If you're in a blue deck, you're going to end up with, 5, 6, 7 sorceries, even if you're not trying very hard, and instants, I should say. So in those cases, it just gets to be a very good card because it's sort of a pseudo removal spell on a body that has prowess and flying. So pretty good. At number 5, we have Dosent of Perfection. A 5-mana 5/4 flyer in this case is our fail case, and that's an even better fail case than Nimbus of Frost was, I think. On top of that, it also has an ability that is at its best, at least, in the blue-red spells deck. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you get a human wizard creature token, and then if you control 3 or more wizards, you can transform Dosent of Perfection. It becomes a 6/5 with flying, pumps all the wizards you made, and still churns out wizards. It's worth noting there are a few other random wizards in the format, so they don't all necessarily have to be the ones that Dosent of Perfection makes, or Final Iteration. You do, however, have to cast at least one instant or sorcery spell for the card to even check if there are enough wizards in play, and then it transforms. But again, the fact that, let's say you first pick this dude, and you're thinking you might be able to make the blue-red spells deck where it's at its best work, but you just don't pick up enough red cards to make red your second color. It's still a 5-mana 5/4 flyer with occasional upside. The same is true of Nimbus of Frost. It's still a 4-mana 3/3 flyer with occasional upside. And that's what makes them good first picks, because they're super powerful if you get them into decks that can really abuse them, but their floor isn't very low either. They're perfectly fine cards, even at their worst. All right, so let's move to number 4, where we have Gisela, the Broken Blade. One half of Brizella. Gisela has insane stats just on her own as a 4-mana 4/3 flyer with First Strike and Lifelink. She's very difficult to kill outside of combat. She quickly swings the game in your favor thanks to high power and Lifelink. If you happen to pick up Bruna and do gain the benefit of being able to make Brizella, that's awesome, but don't have super high hopes for both of those happening. First of all, you'd have to actually draft the other. You'd have to draft Bruna, and then you have to get them both in play at the same time. My guess, the over-under of how often that's actually going to happen for each individual person in the limited format is probably my guess is maybe once ever, but probably less than that. But she is a must-answer win condition on her own because she just completely swings the game in your favor. She can block well. She does everything. She's good at any stage of the game, more or less, as well, and that makes her very good. So she's definitely a first pickable card. So let's go to number 3, where we have Decimator of Provinces. It says it costs 10, and if you cast it for that, it's still pretty game-breaking and good, because it gives your whole team an overrun effect, including itself, although it already has Trample, but it also has Haste. So you're paying 10 mana for a 9/9 Trample Haste, who gives +2/+2 and Trample to the rest of your team. That's a pretty good way to spend 10 mana, but the awesome part is you don't even have to spend 10 mana. It does have triple green in its emerge cost, which is a little bit difficult, but it's just so powerful if you can play this on turn 6 or 7, which is entirely possible, especially if you found a way to go a little wide, but you don't even have to be going that wide. You could have 2 other creatures in play who are a 2/2 and a 3/3, and suddenly you're swinging for, 17 damage, and that's insane. So your opponent's put in a horrible position, and the Decimator sticks around the next turn. May only be a 7/7 after that first turn, but it's still pretty amazing. So at number 2, we have Emrakul, the Promised End. It's the most powerful creature in the format, especially in a vacuum. What's more, it will basically never cost 13 to cast, since it has a pseudo-delirium ability of reducing its cost for each card type in your graveyard. In fact, as we saw in Triple Shadows over Innistrad, a deck that is good at filling its graveyard can pretty reasonably get to 5 card types, and so that means Emrakul, at least by the time you want to be casting it, or can cast it, will cost 8 anyway. So 8 mana for a 13/13 is pretty awesome already, right? But it also has flying, trample, and protection from instants, meaning a lot of the removal in the format won't even work on it. Then you also get to Mindslaver your opponent's next turn, use up all of their instant sorceries you can, attack their creatures into yours, and so on, and completely ruin at least the next couple of turns for them, more than likely. They do get an extra turn after your Mindslaver turn, and frankly, if they didn't get this extra turn after you Mindslaver them, this card would be too good, even in constructed. But by the time they get that turn, you'll have used up as many of their resources as you can and, sort of ruined their board state. So first picking Emrakul and going for a self-mill deck, probably black-green with some ramp in it, seems like a pretty sweet way to start a draft. So what do I have at number 1 if it's not Emrakul? Well, it is Mirrorwing Dragon. I think it's a card that's being somewhat overlooked. I haven't seen many people singing its praises. But it's a 5-mana 4/5 flyer, and that's a pretty great thing to drop on turn 5, something that already immediately asks for an answer, right? Well, if you answer this card, if you're on the opposing side, you cast a removal spell on it, and assuming it's an instant or sorcery spell, you actually have to copy it and target all of your own creatures as well. And that is a scary thing. That means you are probably at least 2 for 1-ing yourself in most situations, and maybe even more. There are some kill spells that maybe only work on Mirrorwing Dragon and wouldn't kill your creatures and things like that, but it's pretty amazing. The one thing that can get through Mirrorwing Dragon's ability are cards that target more than one creature. There are a few spells that can do that, but most other things can't do that. In addition to that, which I think is the primary upside of the card, the fact that it's something you have to kill, but not something that you want to kill, basically, and puts you in terrible situations. Like the best thing you can do is just play a bigger flyer, but how many of those are around? Not a lot. But on top of that, you can also abuse combat tricks with it, the same way you could Zada Hedron Grinder. It can do the same thing with your combat tricks. You can target your Mirrorwing Dragon, copy the spell, and use it on all of your creatures. I think that's sort of a secondary effect that is relevant. I think once you have a Mirrorwing Dragon, you should sort of not prioritize, but combat tricks increase in value for you. The big thing, though, like I said, is just that removal becomes a real pain to use against Mirrorwing Dragon. Like, this is going to be the card that makes you groan the most every time you ever see it, especially on board states where you have, like, your murder in your hand and you actually have more creatures than your opponent, and you have to use murder and kill the Mirrorwing Dragon and your 3 creatures. It's just not what you want to be doing at all. But if you're the one playing Mirrorwing Dragon, you feel pretty great about it. All right, so that does it for my picks for the top 10 bombs in Eldritch Moon Limited, the cards you want to open the most in your first pack. What do you think of the list? Are there any cards you think I left out or overrated? Let me know in the comments. If you found this list useful, don't forget to click the like button. And if you want to see more videos about Eldritch Moon and in the near future drafts of the Eldritch Moon format, don't forget to click the subscribe button below. Thanks for watching.